Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of The Big Story, the coronation of King Charles III. It's very exciting here at the Atlantic. Actually, it's not that exciting for us because we're Americans, but we have today two actual English people who are going to talk about this historic event with us. Two of our London-based staff writers, Sophie Gilbert and Helen Lewis, coming to us from across the Atlantic. Welcome, Sophie and Helen. Everyone who's watching this knows what's happening on Saturday for the first time in most people's lifetimes. There's going to be a new monarch in Great Britain, and Sophie and Helen are two of the most acute observers of the British monarchy. That sounds like that was written by AI, the thing that I just said, but you're very acute. You're extremely acute observers. They've written some great pieces. We'll put those pieces in the chat so you can all see them. They've written pieces before Queen Elizabeth's passing and even up to a couple of days ago, and they'll be covering live round-the-clock coverage from the Atlantic of this upcoming coronation. So thanks both of you for being here. So let me start, and I hope to read a couple of the wonderful passages you've written about this upcoming event in a minute. But let me just start by asking you a question that I've always wondered. What is it? Do you consider yourselves to be subjects of a family, a royal family, a king now, and a queen for your entire lives? And I ask that because as an American, you know, the people are sovereign here in our democracy. And you're familiar with how great our democracy is, I'm sure. But it's so weird and archaic to think that you have a political, almost legal and tribal relationship with some random family whose dramas you all know intimately. So how do you think of yourselves? Are you Republicans, actually? Small R Republicans, to be clear? Do you believe that the monarchy should exist? What's your relationship with this odd concept? Sophie, you go first.
Sophie, yeah, you go first, Sophie.
Yeah, Sophie, you go first. You're it.
Am I a Republican? Is my mom watching this? I think I have come to sort of feel that the monarchy functions as efficiently as it does in Britain now, only because we sort of don't really feel like subjects, and we don't think about the monarchy as having any kind of real power over us. I think it's much more like we think of them in nostalgic terms. They're part of the fabric of the country. They're part of the history. You know, everyone has their sort of memories of the royals growing up, but it's less. It feels less like a construct of in power terms, if that makes sense. And that's why there's the sort of oath of allegiance that has been introduced in the coronation ceremony is relatively controversial, because it sort of takes this relationship that I think is sort of functioning quite well and reminds everyone that actually there is an element of power and there is an element.
Tell us about that oath just for a second, for people who are not familiar.
So Helen, why don't you talk about the oath? Because I think you know more about it than I do.
Yeah, no, traditionally what happened up till 1953 is that you had a procession of all the aristocrats who would all come and swear allegiance, which goes back to, you know, the kind of 10th century when all your barons that you just smote in battle had to come and say, all right, you won, okay, you get to be king. And that they decided that looked a bit kind of having a big procession of dukes was kind of a bit embarrassing. And I think a misguided attempt to make it slightly more democratic, we're like, hey, let's have a way so everyone can join in at home. And so you will be invited to swear your allegiance to the king from the comfort of your sofa.
Do you have to stand, or can you just do it seated?
I mean, we haven't really got any police left, so no one's going to come around and check. So you could do it from the toilet if you want. But as a sort of Republican gesture. But it was really interesting that actually even the most kind of monarchical tabloids kind of found this a dramatic overreach, which I thought was really interesting, because you say that about subjects. I find it very weird to go to American political events. I went to a Ron DeSantis rally last year, and everyone did the Pledge of Allegiance. And again, as I think often when I'm covering American things, I was like, a bit much. You know, we all love our country.
Well, that was because at the Ron DeSantis rally, they substituted the words Ron DeSantis for God. So that was why you were. That was why you were.
Under Ron DeSantis.
That was very cute. Everyone who's watching, that was humor. I apologize. moving on. Go on.
But yeah, I feel very conflicted about this. I used to be a Republican, and actually I now take the Hilary Mantel position, you know, the great author who wrote about Thomas Cromwell and the Tudors, which is that the people it's most cruel to having a royal family is the royal family. The rest of us are getting on just fine. But actually having essentially captured a load of posh people like pandas and put them in a zoo where we just poke them and are rude about them is actually psychological torture to them. The rest of us, as far as I can see, are getting on fine.
Sophie,
there was a great quote in the New York Times where they interviewed a Spanish woman about how she felt. I think she lived in Britain, and they said, you know, how do you feel about the coronation? She had this quote that I think sums up how all of us feel, basically, which is, I don't mind, but I don't care. Like, I think there's a sort of great feeling of ambivalence and apathy at this point towards the royal family where, you know, I think we sort of British people do appreciate continuity and stability. And I think that, for one thing, like, who would do the boring things that the royal family do if the royal family went away? Like, who's going to open the freaking
garden centers
and do the millions and millions of charity patronages that they do? I mean, it's pretty boring work, honestly. So
Can I read for our audience something, Sophie, that you wrote? This is right after the Queen died, and this it's a way of starting this conversation with the mother, not the son. We'll get to the son and his wife, etc., and the sons, the dysfunctional sons, in a few minutes. But this is a piece right after the Queen died. The headline was "No one performed Britishness better than Her Majesty." Britain at this particular juncture in history, seen through infinite cultural lenses, feels more like a performance of a great nation rather than a great nation itself. A tribute show featuring James Bond, Paddington Bear, David Attenborough, and until yesterday, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. We have very little heft in the world anymore. And in parentheses, almost certainly a positive when you consider our truly egregious legacy as colonizers, end parentheses. Our health service is in shreds. Our energy supply is in crisis. Our childcare industry is breaking down. Our workers are striking. Our food banks are empty. Our unelected prime minister, facing all these existential issues and more, seems doggedly bent on cutting taxes rather than investing in the kind of basic infrastructure that might allow people in Britain to have their heart attacks tended to, their homes heated, their children fed. Culturally, though, we're undiminished, even ascendant, and we have the Queen in large part to thank for it. First, I want to say that I think I like Britain more than you do. Just I have very warm feelings toward Great Britain, but we'll put that aside. Talk about that. Talk about what the Queen did for Great Britain in the context of all this litany of woe that you described for Atlantic readers.
Well, I should say I wrote that at a moment when we were very much in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and it just seemed like one crisis after another in British day-to-day life, and things are looking up a little bit now, and I think that's sort of positive going into the coronation, that there is a slight uptick in the national mood. I think the Queen presided over this massive contraction of British power, this moment in history when Britain went from being the most important country in the world to being sort of a really fairly minor economy. But if you do look at culture, which obviously is my realm of coverage, it still feels like it's the last sort of arena in the world where we massively outpunch our size, like outpunch our weight. We produce so many amazing actors, singers, musicians, so much really outstanding cultural fare, a lot of which obviously you end up with in America. But also, I think on moments like this with the coronation, we still have this ability to attract the world's interest. And maybe, Jeff, maybe you'd be better at explaining why that is, like why there is this American fascination with Britain so much, with our royal family, with Downton Abbey, with our history, with our heritage, with our sites. Because to me, it's kind of a little surprising at this point. There's so much to see out in the world, but Britain still seems completely fascinating to really, really a large portion of Americans.
I mean, the answer to that very quickly, and Helen probably has deeper thoughts than I have, is that we consciously threw off the poshness and the regalia and the fancy wigs and the horses and all the fairy princess stuff. But people like that, and so it's completely harmless. It is like watching a show. It's like watching the longest running soap opera in the world for us. And the costumes and the bagpipes and the whole thing. That's my superficial answer. But talk about come to the Queen for a minute, and I'll turn to Helen on this. What was her role in shaping this culturally ascendant but politically diminished, economically diminished country? So just go very specific on that.
I think she knew how to strike a balance between sort of performing as the Queen, but not making it look like fun. Like, she made it look like work. She knew exactly what the public wanted from her, and she performed it impeccably. Like, whenever, at home, she dressed in these sort of very boring tweeds, and she always wore headscarves, and she looked like any other sort of middle-aged English housewife. But whenever she was out doing public events, she would always be wearing like very, very bright colors, and it was because she wanted to be visible. She knew that people would stand there for hours to see her, and she wanted to give them very much what they wanted. And I think she knew that, like, the royal family's position in Britain is precarious, and it's a bargain with the British people, and you always have to be giving them just enough to make them feel like it's a good bargain, because I think there's an awareness among the royal family that this is not an institution that necessarily will last forever otherwise.
How precarious is that relationship between the British people and the royal family, Helen?
I think it's apathy rather than antipathy. I think that's probably how I would characterize it. I think there is a feeling that the 1990s particularly were a horrible time. That was when the Queen talked about the Annus Horribilis. That was when Windsor Castle burned down. That was when the terrible divorces of Charles and Diana were playing out, and Fergie and Andrew. So there is a feeling that kind of crisis has passed, and that William is a kind of in the mold of the Queen. He is willing to spend the next 50 years opening garden centres and not getting himself in trouble. And I think there's something this is why I've kind of come round to monarchy, which is would surprise 20-year-old firebrand leftist Helen a lot, is that I like the idea that you like the kind of Athenian idea of democracy where people just get randomly selected and then they have to be politicians for a bit. I like the idea that we've just gone, if we're going to deify anybody, it's going to be sort of random tweedy people without particularly great aspirations or anything particularly big to say. In a way, that seems weirdly healthier to say we've got to have this, human desire to elevate some people above others, but we're not going to pretend that it's fair. And I think in a way, my problem with the American ideal is there's sort of some idea of just desserts kind of creeps into the people who get lionized. And we just don't have that. We know that the royal family are just there because they happen to be born in the right place at the right time.
Or the wrong place at the wrong time. Depending on, how miserable is the job?
Super miserable. I just don't know why anybody would want it. It's all of the downsides of being a celebrity without any of the upsides of, you can't zoom around on your lovely yacht. We took the yacht away from them. They've barely got a train anymore these days. It's really not it's not an aspirational lifestyle. And they do crank out an enormous number of engagements, which now get recorded in this thing called the court circular. Because there are fewer of them working now. It used to be a kind of cast of thousands with various sort of dukes and subsidiary people, but Charles has always had this vision of what he calls the slimmed down monarchy, and it is now only the kind of core people. So they're doing 200 engagements a year often.
Right. You mean each one?
Each one. And that would be, kind of do you want to go to the Midlands and open a kind of food bank and then go and look at a steam railway museum, and then you'll have to go and meet the ambassador from Luxembourg at a dinner and try and pretend to care about what's happening in Luxembourg.
Right. Let me ask the very obvious question about Charles versus his mother. And I recognize I recognize two things. One, my understanding of this family has been shaped by fiction, sometimes just plain old fiction, sometimes the Crown style, these based on true events sort of thing. And we can talk about that in a minute. But there's also this reality that the Queen, from my outsider perspective, just became more and more popular as she aged. Obviously, there were some bad years, as you note. Charles, never that popular. It seems to me at least. And so I'm wondering, and very few people, obviously, in Britain, much less here, have any experience with any other monarch in Great Britain except the Queen. I'm wondering if you could give us an assessment of how hard it's going to be for him to maintain the monarchy, and how hard it's going to be as someone in his 70s already, with, you know, probably a little bit of diminished energy and so on, to fulfill, not only fulfill the role, but make himself popular.
I mean, he's not even old enough to be US president, so he's not doing that
All
badly.
right.
Sorry, okay, but I think it's interesting that his popularity has trended up since becoming king, in the sense that it's the job that's popular. You know, it's not like these people do go up for election; they kind of handed it. And the other thing that I think will help him is the fact that he has consciously said he's going to depoliticize himself. So part of the reason why he was unpopular is that he did make interventions. You know, he was very into organic farming before it was popular. He likes traditional styles of architecture. He didn't like brutalism or, you know, modern architectural styles. He did say very rude things about the Chinese delegation in memos that got leaked. So, you know, he was somebody that you could have who had strong political opinions. And I think now he's just, you know, he has acknowledged that the job is to fade back and just be the face on the stamps. So I think that will help his popularity, certainly.
Sophie, how successful is he going to be? I mean, he's always been a person with strong opinions. It's interesting you outline those opinions. He a strange thing to say about someone born into a royal family, but he had incredibly progressive ideas about urban spaces and about farming and the environment, and he was mocked for these in the 70s, 80s, 90s. How easy is it going to be for him to, or hard is it going to be for him to actually drop these interests? And I ask this understanding that the job of any royal in UK is not to express yourself spontaneously.
Well, his approval ratings right now, I think, are at 62%, which is pretty high. I think that's about anyone who cares about the royal family in England. So it's not doing too badly. I have a theory about this, which is that he has always, as you said, been sort of our crunchy granola king, or our crunchy granola prince. He's sort of a little bit woo-woo. Like you said, he was really into organic farming. He had a spiritual mentor. He said he once, I think, saw eternity and I've heard of zebras while out having a spiritual experience. But he has kind of been at the forefront of things like antibiotic resistance and organic farming, and so it's sort of, if you look at the invitation to the coronation, it's just amazing. Weird. He has this sort of drawing. It looks like it was drawn by your wacky cousin as like a wedding invitation, and it was done by her friend Christian. I don't know. It's just so strange. There's the green man at the bottom who is a symbol of spring and rebirth, and you know, it's really, really wacky. And I think if he leans maybe more into being weird King Charles, as some people have already named him, it could be good. It could be a good thing. I actually learned some amazing facts about Charles when I was prepping for this today, and one is that he was enormously worried about red squirrels in England and invasive grey squirrels, and so he supported a plan to forcibly sterilize grey squirrels by hiding contraceptives in Nutella. And that is the best fact I've learned about Charles all week. The other thing is that in 2003, he was very worried about nanobots. He was worried that they would turn the world into grey goo. So they haven't done that. I think that was maybe one of his slightly more outre ideas.
It's worth listening to him because he was right about brutalism.
Yeah, and nanobots did get James Bond. So
I don't know much about squirrels or Nutella, but it seems like a reasonable plan. Let me ask you both this, because obviously in America, at least, and I guess by the book sales in the UK too, this is a very salient issue. The issue of Harry and Meghan, and I'm wondering if you could talk about. I mean, this is sort of a capacious question. Talk about it briefly, but talk about the history of controversy in the royal family. Royals who act out, royals who aren't the disciplined Queen Elizabeth or maybe Prince William, as a good example. Is this going to, I mean, give us your analysis of the whole situation and let us know where your sympathies lie, because, you know, I want to make the chat section come alive. But if you both could talk about a little bit about if you think this situation resolves itself, if it actually drags down the entire monarchy, or if Prince Harry lives happily forever after doing yoga in Malibu quietly.
Yeah, you know that expression, don't start a fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel, right? Don't take on the press. I sort of feel a bit the same about don't start a fight with somebody who's got, a crown. Because what tends to happen is that people who are wayward say their piece and go on, but then the institution endures. Edward VIII stomped off to France because he wasn't allowed to marry the woman that he loved, and sat there fulminating for decades afterwards. But the institution carried on. There's loads and loads of examples like that. Lots of wayward princes of Wales. Lots of one of the King Georges put his wife on trial for adultery. There's been scandal before, but what tends to happen is that kind of burns itself out because it's got nowhere to go. You have this great fight, and at the end, one person's still king and one person isn't, and that's how it locks. So my assumption is that I think Harry probably feels a lot better for having therapeutically said his piece, but it's kind of burned itself out now. Like what other challenge can he really offer? I don't know, Sophie, maybe you think differently.
No, I think you're right. It was fascinating to me that his book sold as well as it did. 3.2 million copies in a week is pretty, it's a fairly strong sign of people's interest in the royalty, as I said. But the one thing I would say about Edward VIII is he didn't have a Netflix deal or a podcast. And so Harry and Meghan have this amazing...
By the way, he might have been lucky that he didn't have to come up with podcast ideas.
Right, nothing.
Just saying. That's no joy.
Yeah,
they also
but they
have
do
to
have
send him away to the Caribbean during the Second World War because they were slightly worried he was on the wrong side. Which, say what you like about Prince Harry's not, his loyalty to Britain, I guess, is not in question in the same way. But I take your point. It was a good book, I have to say. I would recommend anybody watching this who hasn't read Prince Harry's book. Very informative about a number of medical issues, apart from anything else.
I think the difference with Harry and Meghan, though, is they sort of can't really go away quietly because they can't get normal jobs now. Like their sort of ability to make money now, I think, is only a function of their celebrity and their sort of performance and their existence in the public sphere. So, they'll always be around. Whether or not people would be always paying as much attention as they do now is a different question.
You both make a very interesting point. It's the shock of this dysfunction is over. The king will be king, and then his eldest son will be king. And it's not clear to me. I'm saying this as a journalist, and I think you both understand what I'm trying to say here. There's not much more that Harry and Meghan can put out in the world that's shocking, and so it's diminishing returns all the time. So yeah, you're going to have to just go work and make money at a certain point because there's not much new you can tell us about your particular dysfunctions or your resentments toward your brother or racism in the royal family. It's all sort of been taken on board, and the king is still being crowned. So maybe it does. You sort of convinced me that all the royal family has to do is be steadfast, continue to be the royal family, and these things fall away. That seems like a likely course. Is there any? And I want to get to the fun stuff in a minute. The what Sophie would call the frippery of this upcoming weekend. But is there any actual threat to the continuity of the monarchy? What would have to happen for the people of Great Britain to rise up and say, you know what, you guys should just go get your own jobs now, and we're not going to do this anymore?
God, I think
we could get a proper bonkers one. That's the problem with it being hereditary, is you really don't get a lot of say over what you're going to get. And if you got one who was, just completely hat stand, then and just did and didn't want to do the job, I think that would be the interesting thing. Like, it's all very well for Harry to go, I'd rather live in Montecito and meditate. But what happens if that's the heir? Like, what if Prince George, who's the current one, decides actually that he's always wanted to be a massage therapist? I think that would be really troublesome. And that is entirely because that's the problem with the hereditary monarchy is, you don't get to pick what's in the box of chocolates. Whatever one comes out, that's the one you have to have.
Sophie, what are the chances that the young prince would want to be a massage therapist when he grows up?
Well, one of the Queen's granddaughter, Sarah Chasso, has a son who was briefly a personal trainer, I think. So it's not completely out of the realm of possibility.
Right.
I think I think they're pretty well. I think if you're an heir, you are pretty well institutionalized from day one, and you. It certainly seems to be that Prince William has long accepted his fate, and he married a nice, normal girl, and they seem to be raising their children in impeccable fashion, as you would hope for someone who is continuing the line of a monarchy. I mean,
Right. Well,
who knows what that means, but.
We have this one question. My thought was prompted by a question from the audience, and this is very relevant, and it's a relevant economic question. If there were no royal family, who would maintain all the royal residences and the art and the archives? Would the I'm not sure the number. One of you, I think, knows the exact number that the taxpayers pay each year to subsidize this family, but the return on the investment is pretty high. Do people in Great Britain understand that part of the excitement of visiting Britain is the changing of the guard and the castles and the palaces and all the rest?
I think we absolutely understand. I think it's fetishized even by us. I mean, I wrote about this in that piece about the Queen, but that, like, I have 2-year-old twins, and they watch Peppa Pig as 2-year-olds do. And the Queen is a character in Peppa Pig. Peppa meets the Queen drives a bus, they go around the Tower of London. I think we sort of, it's tied up so much in our self-identity and in this sort of idealized version of our self-identity that is like the Great British Bake Off and, like, keep calm and carry on, and the things that aren't actually real, but sort of that we really like to think about ourselves as a nation. Helen, what do you think?
Yeah, but the thing is that if you go to France, you can go to Versailles, and their experiment with monarchy ended rather unhappily. Or if you go to Austria, you go to Schönbrunn and the beautiful Habsburg palaces. And again, I interviewed Karl von Habsburg for an Atlantic featuring last year. He now lives in the middle of Europe and kind of works as a mid-level bureaucrat. So you don't have to have royals living in the palaces, but I think there is something about the idea that, particularly when the Queen was still alive, that seeing her was a once in a lifetime. It was like seeing a kind of like a panda, like going to a zoo and seeing a panda again is exactly how it felt to be like, oh, there's only one of her in the world, and kind of I got to see her. And I think people do kind of understand that.
I was looking at the figures today as well. I think the monarchy costs each British person £1.29 a year, which is not that much in the grand scheme of things. You couldn't get a coffee for that.
How much did you, not to send us down a cul-de-sac, but how much did you pay for the mug that you've been drinking from this morning? Will you hold your mug up? We have props.
My mother bought me this mug. It was way more expensive than it should have been, I think. But it says God Save the King on one side, and then it says the environmentalist on the other, which I've been laughing about because it keeps seeming like it's Charles's wrestling name. Like, here comes the environmentalist.
It's a terrible name for a wrestler. It's not a bad name for a king. Again, I do want to get to the frippery, and I promise that we will. But there is another very, very large question, and this question has been coming up again and again, especially since the demise of the Queen. It comes from a couple of people in our viewership right now. Is there any legitimacy for this new monarchy to reign over other countries? So Canada, Jamaica, etc. It was, and this question, very clever question, is asking that kind of Commonwealth relationship that the Queen is the head of state was ingrained in a lot of people in countries that were formerly British colonies. But now you see a lot of, sorry to use a journalism cliche, but restiveness in a lot of places around in the Caribbean, in Africa, and other places about this issue. Some people are arguing that this is an appropriate time to make that break, to say that, you know what, we are going to have an equal relationship, a symbolically equal relationship with our former colonial master. Talk about the political dynamic a little bit, and talk about, if you could, bringing us to the coronation itself, how that's going to manifest itself, how this issue is going to manifest itself at the coronation. Are the prime ministers and foreign ministers and so on of Commonwealth countries going to come and pledge any sort of allegiance or loyalty or any kind of oath to the new king?
Do you want me to pick this one up?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, there's already been so for example, the crown that Camilla will be using is based on Queen Mary's crown, but they have taken out the Kohinoor diamond, which was lifted from a Maharaja, and replaced it with one of the Cullinan diamonds, which were mined in South Africa, but were given freely to Britain as a gift rather than being looted. So there are always those kind of, when you're dealing with lots of really old stuff, I mean, Britain's museums are full of stuff that we nicked from other countries, and it's all become quite embarrassing now. So that is always something that's there. I think with the Commonwealth, the feeling is that that is done by consent, and those countries have opted to join it. For example, it was really interesting to me that Charles went over in 2021, I think, when Barbados became a republic, and he stood there embarrassed looking through the ceremony, which they basically told him to sod off. And that's one of the things that I think has been good about what the Queen did. Like, I remember thinking about the fact that Donald Trump didn't go to Biden's inauguration, right, and how graceless that looked. Part of wielding power is also knowing how to hand it on to the next person and how to cede power in a graceful way, and that is a really powerful thing that I think people want to be part of. So I think there will be no resistance whatsoever from the royal family if more Commonwealth countries follow the lead of Barbados, but I don't think it's something that they will actively volunteer for themselves.
Sophie?
I mean, I agree with Helen. I mean, I think we are at the beginning of a really important conversation, I think, not just about the Commonwealth, but also, you know, there's a lot of debate right now about reparations and about, you know, just Britain's really egregious history on this front, and what we do owe so many other countries, and how we can begin to think about starting to make amends for that. And so much of returning what's been in our museums is a part of that. And I just think it has to be, for every individual country, a question of what the people want, and whether the relationship feels like it's one for them that deserves to be continued, or whether actually independence at this point is something that they would rather seek out.
Do you think Charles will care if more countries like Barbados say thank you, but no thank you?
It's such a good question. I mean, I'm sure as the king, I'm sure he has his preferences, but I don't know, he's shown himself to be fairly complex in his thinking in the past. So, I mean, the Daily Mirror had a cartoon I think they mocked him in 1984 because they envisaged him as king, as sitting on a throne wearing a caftan and eating muesli, which is actually not super far away from what we're getting next week. But, you know, I think he's open to debates and he will receive them thoughtfully, but what he believes, I don't know.
I mean, the Queen, by virtue of just simply having been so old, having been born in 1926, grew up with parents who were at one point Emperor and Empress of India. So she could remember the time when Britain was an empire. And he's of that post, you know, empire generation. I don't think he's attached to it in the same way, you know. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, actually. The place I think probably might go first would be Australia. Australia has got quite high Republican sentiment, and I think it was only the presence of the Queen that really tilted the last referendum. So I think you will see a kind of gradual drifting away. The other thing that's really interesting about the coronation is it will be a much less white coronation than 1953, as you might expect, not just because the complexity of Britain has changed, but also because Charles has made sure particularly to include other faith leaders, particularly minority faith leaders in there. So the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who is Hindu, whose parents were Indian, he's going to be reading from the New Testament. He's doing a reading at the service. You know, various members of the House of Lords will be bringing up like the ceremonial glove and stuff like that. The chief rabbi will be walking over from Clarence House because it's the Sabbath. You know, there has been a real effort to try and make this incredibly multicultural and multi-faith, which is one of the things that weirdly you can do a lot easier when you've got all the gold brocade and the trumpets and all that kind of stuff, because it's just self-evidently there is no such thing as a kind of woke coronation, and yet so that means you can push it a lot further in terms of saying this is what modern Britain actually looks like now.
Right. Let me ask you about the coronation. One of the fascinating things I learned from reading you two is that, and I had no idea, that each coronation has its own ceremonial dish. And I guess the last time around it was curry chicken, which was quite multicultural for the 50s, if I'm not mistaken. But Helen, you wrote in, I want to read this little passage. It starts talking about the quiche that is the official dish of this coronation. This is from a piece that we posted just the other day with the very Helen Lewis headline, King Charles's Very Hobbity Coronation. And it's it's a very, very smart story about what this coronation will suggest about the incoming king, the new king's character. Here are the lines that I want to share with people listening. I'm going to try to read this without laughing because some of it is quite amusing. The quiche, she's talking about the royal quiche, if you will. The quiche is simple to make, can be easily adapted for those with allergies, and much like the royal family's ongoing revenge on Prince Harry, is a dish best served cold. I hesitate to read too much into a quiche, but you could argue that the, quote, popular oven-baked savory tart, thank you, the Times, that's how the Times described it, is a symbol of the new king's political outlook. Charles's worldview is hard to describe because it blends eco-radicalism and deep traditionalism. He's been talking about green issues since the 1970s. He was way ahead on the curve on organic farming, but his environmentalism is very different from the leftist doomer vibes of Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil. Instead, it springs from an aristocratic sense of merely passing through the world, of being a custodian for the next generation. The royal family loves sustainability, as you might too, if you'd inherited all your sofas. So talk about how the coronation is going to reflect both this kind of, it's going to be both a woke coronation, but also an exceedingly not woke coronation. What should we be looking for, those of us playing at home, to suggest these seemingly discordant pathways that it's going to have to go down simultaneously?
Well, the anointing oil that's being used is a very good example. So one of the oldest bits of coronation regalia is the ampulla and the spoon, which has got a dent in it so you can put your fingers in it. So the king then gets anointed on the head and hands and chest. And that oil is going to be vegan because it will not contain ambergris, which is made of the intestines of whales, nor will it contain civet musk, which is made from the anal glands of a cat. And, that to me just seems like probably a great decision all round. But for all that the kind of Daily Mail went, the vegan coronation oil, it's actually also a very sweet story, which is that it's harvested from olives grown on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, where Charles's grandmother, who became she became a member of a religious order, went and she died there and is buried there. So that's the kind of classic thing where actually, you know what, he's made a kind of cruelty-free, no animal testing oil, but it's also one with really deep symbolism that goes back to the Holy Land. So that's the kind of thing. Like other stuff, like he's got his coronation chair is like a reupholstered one from a previous coronation. So he has the kind of make, do and mend, which, as I say, when you've got a lot of old pots and pans hanging around the place, some of them priceless, is kind of a bit easier to do. But that's the blending of old and new that I find really interesting.
Helen, just one follow-up to that. How long have you been waiting to say anal gland cats in an Atlantic event? I think you've been waiting for
consistently lowering the tone of any Atlantic event that I'm in.
No. You're doing a great job. Great job. It's fascinating. Totally fascinating. Go on, Sophie. Sorry.
Well, I wanted to say something about the quiche, because when the quiche was announced, it is a quiche with broad beans and spinach and tarragon. I think when it was announced, I was like, that sounds horrible. But the quiche has actually offended everyone. Like the Socialist Party of England said it hates the quiche because it's too posh. The Reform Party called it foreign muck. Like the foodie crowd hates the quiche because it's too 70s, and the scolds hate the quiche because it's using too many eggs and we're in an avian flu shortage. And the French have now come out and said that actually it's not a quiche at all, it's a tart, and only a quiche Lorraine can be a quiche. So everyone hates the quiche, and in that sense the quiche is uniting everybody because they're all offended by it. I might actually make a quiche now, just
that's very British though, isn't it? Like we're all really enjoying moaning about the quiche, but nonetheless someone offers you some of the quiche, you eat the quiche.
You'll have a quiche.
Fine.
Just explain this during the holiday that's declared for the coronation. You're all supposed to make and eat this quiche. Is that the guidance from the government?
There are 3 days of festivities. So on Saturday is the official coronation, and then Sunday everyone's supposed to have street parties and cook for their neighbors, and then Monday everyone, I think it's called, like, it's a big volunteering day where you're supposed to give back to your community and do good deeds. So there's like it's a whole 3-day extravaganza. But yes, the idea is on Sunday make the quiche and serve it to people.
Sophie, what are you looking for in the ceremony?
Oh God, Andrew Lloyd Webber has written this song for the official ceremony honor, which apparently it's called Make a Joyful Noise. And the king's one request was that it be hummable. Stephen Sondheim, who died last year, famously, his works were critiqued for not being hummable enough. So this will be a hummable Andrew Lloyd Webber anthem for the new king. And I don't know if I'm like horrified or like relishing this prospect. But I mean, the cultural side of it is interesting because they are having a big concert on Sunday, and invited a number of high profile British performers who said no. I think Adele said no, Ed Sheeran said no. So we've ended up with a lot of Americans now. We've got Lionel Richie and Katy Perry. I think Take That, the band, is briefly there. But yeah, it's a strange old lineup.
What happened? That sounds like a Trump inauguration.
It does, doesn't it? It's weird because I don't think of the coronation as being as toxic as Trump's inauguration, but it has been surprisingly hard to find A-listers.
Why won't British artists perform? I mean, this is sort of a once in a generation, obviously, or more than a generation event. What happened there? What were the political dynamics there?
I think there was such a profound and important conversation happening after the Queen died about the royal family's role in colonialism and in atrocities across history, and Britain's role. And I think that has certainly possibly led some performers to feel like it would not be worth being present at such a high profile concert. But maybe Adele just had things going on. I don't know. Ed Sheeran's on tour.
Is that the biggest challenge facing this king? To reconcile Britain's past with his role itself?
To me, it's certainly up there. I don't know what else is important for him to do at this point other than keep persuading people that the royal family is worth having, keep the peace.
How far can he go in apologizing, or sort of apologizing, for his own family's past without traditionalists looking at him and saying, not only did we have a woke coronation, but we have a too woke king?
I think it depends on the moment. I think this is a generational, there's a big generational divide in who is sort of invested in this. Like people of my parents' generation, I think, have a very different attitude to people of my generation, and certainly like younger people.
Yeah, Helen, any thoughts on that?
I think in a way the Harry-Meghan situation kind of helps them with that, because there's now, like it's like in a primary race where if you're the kind of mediumly left candidate, then what you really want is someone who's sort of borderline a communist to kind of, just separate yourself away and kind of go, well, I'm not that. And so I think there is a reminder now that there's a lot further out in terms of modern discourses on race and colonialism that the king could be at. And actually he's very much within the kind of middle kind of ground of British sentiment on it, right? I would say to middle to left, actually. And I think they will subtly do stuff. The Guardian has been running this long series about the kind of links to slavery and colonialism, whether or not they had investments in the Royal African Company and so on. And Buckingham Palace is kind of cooperating with that. They're open to that idea. They're not, as I say, they took the Kohinoor out of the, they don't want to make mistakes like that. But as Sophie says, there is just a hard limit. They're a British institution, and all British institutions are compromised by Britain's imperial history.
Right. Let me just ask finally, to end on a slightly lighter note, what is the single aspect of the coming weekend you're both most excited about, apart from writing wonderful stories so that our Atlantic readers can read your understanding of what's happening? What's the most exciting part?
I went on the official coronation website and looked at activities, and one of the suggested activities to get to know your neighbours was a game called Human Bingo, which I resolutely will not be playing with anyone this weekend, but I'm excited if anyone does play it.
It's better than AI bingo.
What that entails. Yeah, there's also an official coronation playlist, which for some reason features Daddy Cool by Boney M and Slave to the Rhythm by Grace Jones. It's a troll. I think it must be a troll. It makes no sense.
Helen, apart from the Quiche, obviously, anything really moving you?
I'm really looking forward to the fact that this is one of the very few state occasions in which people can wear tiaras. I know, sorry that this makes me sound like I'm 9,000 years old, but it's really exciting because we have got some absolutely banging tiaras and they don't get them out very often. There's rumours that Kate might not wear the Cambridge Lovers Knot tiara, which is her big fave. She might wear a flower crown, which is a bit hippie in my view, but it'll be really quite exciting to see. I mean, the British royal family's got some spectacular bling. The sceptre has got the biggest flawless diamond in the world. It's the size of a hen's egg, and it's incredible. And I love it. I'm sorry.
She loves bling.
my most British opinion. I just love tiaras. I can't help myself.
I didn't know that you quite loved bling so much. I have to keep that in mind in future assignments. Sophie, Helen, this has been very, very, very interesting and highly amusing, but also serious. And I really appreciate your time, as do our readers and viewers. I want to thank everyone who's watching for coming out and supporting the Atlantic and its journalism. You see, we have a staff filled with extremely articulate geniuses, and it's a joy every day to be around them. Let me just mention that if you're not a subscriber, Sophie, Helen, and I would like you to be a subscriber. And finally, let me mention that the Atlantic Festival is coming up in late September, September 28th, 29th. You could sign up at, I'm going to read this to get it right, theatlantic.com/TAF, that's TAF, the Atlantic Festival 23, to receive updates. It's going to be a very, very exciting festival. We're going to have tiaras and scepters this time, so you should definitely come. And on behalf of the Atlantic, thank you all for joining us today, and enjoy the festivities. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.